The topic of Chapter 3 is cellular adaptation, injury, and death. So we will discuss those topics here. Again, a reminder, look at the ULOs and compare them to kind of what you see in the reading and what you see here. What you will be evaluated on is really based on those ULOs and our discussions from the PowerPoint presentations. So we're going to start with cellular adaptation. So cellular adaptation is a protective mechanism for the cell. It's designed to try to prevent cellular and tissue harm, and it's usually started because there's some kind of stressor on the cells themselves that's forcing them to adapt to prevent cell death. Okay, so cells are adapting to these changes within their internal environment. So when confronted with stressors that endanger that normal structure or function of the cell undergoes these adaptive changes that help it survive and maintain its function or maintain what we call homeostasis or balance within the cell. Okay. So cells adapt to increased work demands by changing either in size, and those are the cellular adaptations of atrophy and hypertrophy. We're going to talk about all of these. Cells can also adapt by increasing in number, we call that hyperplasia, or by changing in overall form, we call that metaplasia. So only when the stresses coming from the external environments that are forcing this adaptation, when those stressors start to overwhelm or those adaptations that we're making are ineffective, then we can start to see cell injury and cell death. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay. But let's start with those types of cellular adaptation that I mentioned. And the first one is what we call atrophy. And this is when the cells themselves decrease in size. And as those cells decrease in size, they have less organelles, they're producing less energy, but they're also producing kind of less oxygen, those kind of things. So it is an adaptive mechanism really for the body to try to use less oxygen and less energy by shrinking down those cells that it's not really using. So we do consider it a cellular adaptation. But a lot of different things can cause atrophy or a decrease in size of your cells. So one is denervation. So if we lose the nervous tissue signaling of a particular tissue, it will start to atrophy. So, in the case of spinal cord injury, when we have damage to the nerves within the spinal cord and now we don't have transmission of signals to the muscle fibers, those muscle fibers or those muscle cells start to atrophy and shrink. So denervation is one cause of atrophy. Another is loss of endocrine stimulation. So if we have cells that are being stimulated by some kind of feedback mechanism within the endocrine system, if we lose that stimulation, those cells can start to atrophy. Others are inadequate nutrition. If we don't have proper nutrients to continue with cell growth and energy, we might start to see atrophy. Ischemia or decreased blood flow to the cells can also cause atrophy because we've lost kind of that oxygen supply. The cell starts to kind of shrink, shut itself down to adapt, and we see atrophy. The next type of cellular adaptation is hypertrophy, and that's an increase in cell size. So each individual cell itself is growing. We're not getting more cells. The same amount of cells are still present in that tissue. They're just larger. Okay, so that's hypertrophy. So typically hypertrophy is caused by an increased workload that is being imposed on some organ or body part that can't go through cellular replication. It can't increase the amount of cells. So that increased workload causes those cells to grow. So the most common place we see this is in cardiac and skeletal muscle tissue. Because if you remember back to our discussion about different types of tissues within the body, you'll remember that skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle do not replicate themselves. So their only adaptation available when presented with increased workload is to grow, right? And people leverage this, right, with skeletal muscles by increasing the workload of skeletal muscles to try to gain hypertrophy to have more muscled kind of look, right? In cardiac tissue, this happens as well, and we'll talk about that a lot when we get to topics of things like hypertension and heart failure. It's a cellular adaptation based on increased workload of the heart, but it actually is a one that causes more problems, right, later on. So you'll see that hypertrophy conversation come up largely with, again, what's happening to cardiac muscle when its workload is increased. Okay, again, because we can't go through that mitotic cell division in those muscle tissues. The next type of adaptation is hyperplasia, and this is an increase in the number of cells. So hyperplasia occurs in tissues where cells are capable of mitotic division or cellular replication. So you'll see this in places like the epidermis, the intestinal epithelium, and in glandular tissues. And if you remember all those things, what they have in common is that that's all epithelial tissues. So within epithelial tissues, because they're able to grow, replicate, divide, we see an adaptation like hyperplasia occurring there. The next adaptation is metaplasia. So metaplasia is a replacement of an adult cell. So we have one type of cell, and because of some kind of stressor, and usually in the case of metaplasia, that stressor is something like chronic irritation or inflammation of the cells themselves, we start to change the form or the type of cell we have. So these new cell types tend to be more hardy and more resistant to harsh conditions, but they don't function the same. So one example of metaplasia that I would give you is the cells within the lungs in response to cigarette smoke, that kind of constant irritation and inflammation because of that toxin starts to change. It starts to cause metaplasia or change of those cells themselves, again, trying to make them, harder, hardier, more resistant. But the problem is that when that type of cellular change happens, when that metaplasia happens, those cells now don't function in the same way that they were intended to. So, like in the case of lung tissue, now we don't have like the same ability of like expansion and recoil that's necessary within the lungs. So it gets harder for that person to exchange oxygen. It gets harder for them to breathe. We see all kinds of changes to the function itself. The cells are still alive. They're just not functioning the way that they're supposed to. Okay. And the final type of cellular adaptation is something called dysplasia. And so this is deranged cell growth of a specific type of tissue. We see a lot of dysplasia, especially, similar to metaplasia with chronic irritation and inflammation. And we call it an adaptive response because it can be reversed under normal conditions. So if like that stressor of irritation or inflammation goes away, we can see, that dysplastic kind of adaptation stop. But the problem with dysplasia, and the other thing to understand about it, is that it's often thought of as a precursor to cancer too. So we'll talk about dysplastic changes to tissue when we get to the cancer unit, but it remains in this adaptation bucket because it doesn't always lead to cancer. So we leave it here. So there are a lot of different things, a lot of different categories, a lot of different, environmental kind of things that can cause um, injury and then potentially damage or death to the cells. Okay. So we're going to talk specifically about those things that fall under the physical agents piece. So we'll talk about 3 of those here in a moment. Another thing that can injure cells is radiation injury. We'll talk about radiation injury and how we use that when we talk about neoplasias, cancers and their treatment. And we'll also talk about the damage that radiation causes when we get to discussion about skin disorders. So we'll kind of leave that for now. As far as chemical injury, there are a lot of chemicals that are capable of damaging cells, and those chemicals are kind of everywhere around us all the time. And there's probably a lot of chemicals that can cause injury that we're not even really fully aware of or that are evolving. So this is a category that remains large, broad, and probably largely misunderstood. So things like air and water pollution, when air and water become contaminated with pollutants, they can become capable of causing tissue injury. Tobacco smoke is definitely a chemical injurious agent. Processed food and preserved food, we've known for many, many years that food preservatives, especially, things like cured meats, those kind of things really lead to cancer um, formation. So we know that that's something that's causing injury to cells. Things like gases like carbon monoxide, insecticides, metals like lead and mercury. Those are all chemical agents that can cause damage. And another huge category is drugs, whether it's over-the-counter drugs, whether it's prescription drugs, whether it's illicit or street drugs. Alcohol falls into that category. All of those things can be considered chemical injurious agents. Biological agents, so injury from biological agents, that's cellular injury that's caused by things like bacteria, viruses, parasites. And then the final piece is injury from nutritional imbalances. So that's either an excess or a lack of a certain nutrient in somebody's diet. So excess, if we have someone who maybe has excess intake of things like saturated fats, those things can lead to problems like obesity that can further lead to things like damage to epithelial linings within the blood vessels. They lead to heart disease, stroke, all those kind of things. Um, you know, and then the other side of that is lack of nutrients in the diet. So things like starvation, which leads to a lack of amino acids. So we can't build proteins, iron deficiency, anemias, lack of vitamin C and scurvy. So lots of different nutritional imbalances, either too much or too little, that can cause cellular injury. So a little bit more about injury from physical agents. So one physical agent that can damage cells are mechanical forces, and that's when the body just makes, sudden impact with another object. And so that can cause tissues and cells to split, to be torn. It can break bones. It can rip or tear blood vessels. It can interrupt blood flow. So mechanical forces can cause a wide range of injury to cells. Temperature extremes can also cause injury. So things like heat exposure, so things like burns or extreme heat stroke, they cause vascular injury. They speed up the metabolism of the cells themselves. That require that sped up metabolism does things like massively increasing the amount of energy production needed, uses up all of our oxygen supply to those cells. So cell death can start to happen from that increased metabolism as we run out of nutrients and energy to sustain it. Um, it can cause disruption of the cell membrane. If we don't have a cell membrane, if the cell membrane is disrupted, broken, that cell cannot survive. It can also change enzyme activities within the cells. Extreme cold exposure can cause increased blood viscosity, and what we mean by that is the blood itself gets a lot thicker. And it also, cold exposure causes vasoconstriction. So the blood vessels themselves kind of clamp down or really close down tightly. And so now we don't have good blood supply to our tissues. So our blood flow to tissues is impaired, and that can cause hypoxia of those tissues, so lack of oxygen, and then overall cell death. So electrical injury is another type of injury from physical agents. So the body can act as a conductor of electricity. So if the body comes in contact with an electrical supply, it can cause significant tissue injury. We also, as we talked about with action potentials, we have electrical signals happening within the body all the time. And that exposure to electrical energy not only causes tissue injury, but it also disrupts the neural and cardiac electrical impulses that were already happening within the body. So it can cause things like significant cardiac arrhythmias, which can be lethal. It can disrupt neural transmission in places like the respiratory centers of the brain. So if that were to happen, you could lose your respiratory drive. Again, because the body can act as a conductor of electricity. That movement of electricity through the tissues can also cause extensive muscle and deep tissue injury. It damages blood vessels. It can cause significant electrical burns, especially where we have entrance and exit of electricity in the body. When we talk about cell injury, sometimes cells can become injured and that injury is reversible. The function of the cells themselves might be impaired, but they're not cell death hasn't occurred, and maybe that cellular injury can be repaired. So reversible cell injury doesn't impair the cell, but or impairs the cell's function, but it does not result in immediate cell death. So there are really two patterns of reversible cell injury that we can see. One is cellular swelling. So the cells themselves are literally swelling. They're getting larger. They're kind of stressing and stretching their cellular membranes. And the other is fatty changes within the cells. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the cellular swelling piece, and this goes back to the topics we've already talked about, because cellular swelling largely occurs when we see impairment of that energy-dependent sodium-potassium pump, okay? And we get impairment of that pump in hypoxic states, because if you remember back to when we talked about that sodium-potassium pump, and it requires ATP to function, and if we become hypoxic, our body is largely moving into that anaerobic metabolic state. So we're not producing as much ATP as we do in the presence of oxygen. Without the presence of sufficient ATP, we now can't power those sodium-potassium pumps that require active transport. And without that sodium-potassium pump, we start to get a buildup of potassium inside of the cell. That buildup of potassium in the cell pulls water towards it, and that cell will start to swell, okay? So again, impairment of that energy-dependent sodium-potassium pump, usually as the result of hypoxic cell injury, or that shift from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism causes that cellular swelling. If we are able to reintroduce oxygen, if we're able to reverse the hypoxia of those cells before that cell swells too much and dies, that impairment can be reversed. So that's why it's imperative when patients who are hypoxic or who have lack of oxygen to certain tissues, that's why it's really important to, as quickly as possible, reverse that hypoxic state, whether it's by increasing blood flow, whether it's by increasing oxygen delivery, whatever it might be. But we do have to reverse that anaerobic state quickly to prevent this reversible cell damage from becoming permanent. Okay. So again, hypoxia causes this overall power failure within the cell. It has widespread effects on the cell's structure and functional components. And as you recall too, if you remember back to anaerobic metabolism, we also get lactic acid production, which changes the pH in the body. We'll talk about that extensively when we get to acid base. But that can become damaging to the cells as well. And again, that acute swelling or that swelling of the cells when we get sodium starting to build up from the malfunction of the sodium potassium pump pulling water inside. Okay. So hypoxic cell injury, we've got a deprivation of oxygen to the cells. It interrupts oxygen metabolism or aerobic metabolism, and it interrupts that generation of ATP. We get cellular swelling. Okay. So the best thing we can do here is to reverse hypoxia. So some of the common causes of hypoxia: inadequate amount of oxygen in the air. So think about maybe someone at extreme elevation. There's just not as much oxygen available. It could be because of respiratory disease. So the respiratory tissue itself may be compromised. So we don't have what we call good gas exchange. We're bringing in enough oxygen through the respiratory system. It might be an inability of the cells themselves to use oxygen. It might be because of edema causing a disruption in the delivery of oxygen to the cells, or it might be from ischemia. So we don't have, good blood flow to the cells and tissues themselves.